Hello, everybody. This is Professor Connor, and I'm going to go through the lecture pieces for the ATP and energy piece. So we're just going to get right into it. So I'm going to share the actual PowerPoint. So we're going to go here. Okay. Hopefully you can see that pretty well. So this is lecture for energy and ATP cycles. So we're just going to go through the PowerPoint. There's a lot of different connections that we've made so far or thus far as far as some of these terms, and we're just adding a few terms to them so that you can include those into your vocabulary. This is actually building up to chemiosmosis a little bit as far as how cellular respiration works and that ATP cycle that has to do with photosynthesis as well. So the first slide that we're looking at here is how energy enters into the system. And remember, this is kind of like a cycle that we rely on heavily as far as humans versus plants, and how that is basically like a full circle kind of thing. So energy enters into the ecosystem as light. We all know that. Photosynthesis. It captures the carbon from the atmosphere, and then it makes two distinct pieces when we're looking at how that works. There is the dark and light reactions on both sides, but both of those has the main goal for photosynthesis is to create glucose, something you might want to remember for the final. This is kind of where the only piece of photosynthesis gets pulled into the final exam, is how it connects back to cellular respiration and makes those connections and how that works. So it pulls in light energy. It uses something similar to chemiosmosis that we're going to learn next week to make that organic molecule of glucose in the end. And that is using that capturing carbon from the atmosphere and then again using light energy. And water is on that flip side when we're looking at photosystem 2 and 1 to create the hydrogen ions that gets flipped over. And as a byproduct, we get oxygen out of that system, and then the glucose is the ultimate goal. So this is what this is right here. So we get the oxygen as a byproduct from the first part of the system, and then glucose is the ultimate goal as we're pulling in those carbons. Energy does exit as this ecosystem as heat, and so when we're looking at this, it'll all make sense in a minute when we start adding labels on each side. Cellular respiration is what we humans do. That respiration breaks down organic molecules, the glucose that's created during photosynthesis, and produces ATP within our cells, which is used as energy. So out of that, heat is released again, and hydrogen or carbon dioxide and water is the byproducts or the products of both of those. As we're breaking down glucose, we're adding in water or oxygen, and we're getting oxygen being released or water being released and carbon dioxide being released. So this is a piece of thermodynamics. We have two kinds of systems, open system versus closed system. Energy being transferred in and out is where we're looking at the open system. If the energy cannot be transferred in or out, it stays within the system, it is closed. So we are considered in the thermodynamic world, we are considered an open system because we are releasing and taking in energy in order for that system to create or to be working on like normal. So for us, it breaks down into kinds of different things. So I'm going to move this over just a little bit. How it's transformed. So light energy, again, we talked about photosynthesis and how that energy is created through glucose and oxygen and it's released. Energy is transformed in what we eat. So we get different types of chemical energies on both sides. We get um, chemical energy that has to do with short term, and then we have long term energy kept, energy released on both sides. So, oops, sorry. Some energy can be transformed, but most is lost. So if we're looking at the levels of how those levels take in and release energy as it goes up the stack, you get most of your energy near the bottom, and as you go up, you're losing most of it as energy or heat energy, and you're only getting about 10% from the bottom level. So the trophic level versus like the tertiary level and the top of the food chain usually gets about 10% of 10% of 10%. So during those transitions, there's a heat energy that's being lost as things move from the bottom layer of the plants and all of that through each one of those secondary consumers, first consumers, that kind of thing. You're losing most of that as heat energy. So there's two other pieces that we're looking at as far as energy within systems, and that's kinetic energy and potential energy. And for those of you who are follow physics, this will make a lot of sense. So potential energy is stored energy. For example, a ball at the top of a hill before it starts rolling is potential. There's energy stored within the ball. As it starts moving, now we have kinetic energy that's introduced. Or in the case of the picture being shown, water sitting at the top that's not moving until it hits that waterfall, and now we're at potential, or we're in kinetic energy. Another example of kinetic versus potential is if you go to lagoon and you're in the roller coaster and the roller coaster sitting at the top and it's not moving yet, that is your potential energy. Once the roller coaster starts to move down and go on the coaster and starts moving, now we have kinetic energy. So potential energy at the top where it's not moving, and as it's going through the motion of moving, now we have kinetic energy that's being created as the elements are moving. When we're looking at our elements that we take in, there's potential energy as far as the energy, say, in glucose, where we're doing short-term energy, we use it rather quickly, then it starts moving us. It's used fast. I guess that's the best way to represent what this picture is that we have the fast energy from the glucose and the carbs, but then we also have stored energy within our bodies and in our systems, which is our lipids, fats, that actually is potential energy that's being stored. So if you're looking at it in a biomolecule way, that's kind of how it is translated. One of the other pieces that we're looking at is Gibbs free energy, and that is the amount of free energy that's actually available within a system to actually do the work. So when we're looking at reactants and products, depending on how they flip, that Gibbs free energy is actually what is available in order for that system to happen. So if we're looking at a product, a reactant, and we end up with a product. So sometimes the reactants together, the energy being released, we have to take away the energy that has been created by the reactants and based on the product. So if we're looking like at a system, a flow system in a biosystem, a bio, like say a ecosystem, you look at how much energy is available, how much energy is used, and then our overall energy amount is what's left over after the bill is paid. So free energy, how much we actually take in, how much is used to be able to make that system work, and then what the products are at the end is kind of the same thing as we're looking at. We have those reactants that actually have to have the energy in order for it to make something else. And then we have to take away the energy that's available or that was used in order to get to the product. So that's what that equation looks like. So releasing energy is exergonic. So if we take reactants and we're releasing energy out, which is the second half of this, so the energy that is actually used in order to get the product, then that is exergonic. If we're looking at an exergonic reaction in general, energy is released. That's one of the things that is basically a good definition for that. But products have less free energy than reactants in the long run. So Gibbs energy, if it's less than zero, then we're in an exergonic reaction. If the products have less energy than the reactants did when they started, we have an exergonic reaction. And so if we're looking at, like, for example, free energy, the transitional state to the progress of the action, if it is higher or lower, that's your free energy on the bottom. If it's less than zero than what was needed to start with, you have that exergonic. And again, if you look at an enzyme, there is free energy. This is an example of that. You have free energy that is needed for those reactions to take place. And of course, if you have an enzyme, it actually does help with the reaction. It actually allows the reaction to happen without energy having to be added in. And so this is an example of this graph is showing you the course of the reaction with that enzyme. So more energy is needed in order to get to the correct product at the end. And so the energy here without the enzyme is higher. And then this is with the enzyme is a lower energy needed. So the reactants here start with a lower energy. The enzyme helps out, less energy is needed. We're still getting to the same product, but you can kind of see what's expended and what's not. And then how that Gibbs free energy is affected. So as far as energy that's available to do the work, if it's requiring energy from the reactants, if there's more energy needed to get to the product, then we're looking at an endergonic reaction. So products have more free energy than the reactants do. So if that Gibbs energy is higher than 0, energy is required, therefore it's an endergonic reaction. So an exergonic energy is released. Endergonic, it's being pulled in for the reaction to occur. That's the best way to remember how each one of those kind of fit. And then in an endergonic reaction, not only is Gibbs free energy higher than 0, but the reaction itself is not spontaneous. The difference for exergonic is usually spontaneous. So energy has to be added in there to get the product. So if you look at that, energy is a lot higher versus the other PowerPoint that we did before, or the other picture. It's less than 0. Energy is released versus energy being pulled in. And so the product has a higher level of free energy than the reactant started with. So that's kind of how you're looking at that. So the Gibbs free energy is higher at the end of the reaction that it started with. So if we're looking at both processes, exergonic versus endergonic, here's how they kind of relate to other vocabulary words that we've already looked at before. So if we're looking at exergonic, catabolic, we're thinking about catabolic. So we're breaking those larger molecules into smaller molecules. We've talked about this before. So this process actually releases energy. So this is another way to kind of connect it back to what we've been doing over the last few weeks in class. Endergonic is that anabolic where we're taking those smaller pieces and we're building up to bigger pieces. And so that requires energy in order for them to be able to stick together. And again, this is all the energy required for this is higher than the energy that it is if it's just sitting there and not having the reaction happen at all. And again, one thing to point out is exergonic reactions are spontaneous, endergonic reactions are not. So that's another huge big difference. So if we're looking at vocabulary for sure, exergonic is connected to catabolic, which means we're taking big pieces and breaking them down. It releases energy and it is spontaneous. Endergonic is the opposite. We're connecting it back to those anabolic processes that we talked about where we're building large molecules from the smaller ones, and it requires energy, but it is not spontaneous. So if you're looking at anything for the exam, this slide right here gives you all of the vocabulary, all of the things that you need technically for this part of the lecture. So other things we want to take into consideration is that work is performed by all cells or by a lot of cells, most cells all the time. Some examples of that is when we're talking about transport, like diffusion or osmosis, or anytime we're doing any type of transport through the cell. Macromolecule synthesis, so DNA replication, mRNA synthesis, protein, lipid synthesis, any movement, all of these are work, and it either requires energy or it's endergonic, which is it's releasing, or I'm sorry, it's exergonic or endergonic, and exergonic releasing, endergonic pulling in. So the energy from the exergonic reaction, say of ATP hydrolysis, can be used to drive endergonic reactions. So if we're looking at phosphates, right? So we have phosphates that are negatively charged. And so when we're pulling that and we're going from, say, adenosine triphosphate, which is those 3 phosphates on the end that are negatively charged, and we're trying to build or break it down to where we have adenosine triphosphate. So we want that phosphate separate or taken off. We're looking at a catabolic reaction, right? Because we're going from a big piece to a smaller piece, which means that it is exergonic and the Gibbs free energy is less than zero. So the energy needed for that reaction is lower than the actual product. So this also connects back to hydrolysis, remember? Because if we're breaking down big pieces into small pieces, we're adding water into that reaction. And so energy is released because it's used to do the cellular work. If we're looking on the flip side again, so if we're going from adenosine diphosphate to triphosphate, we're building that back up. We're going from an anabolic position. So we're going from little pieces, building them back up to the big pieces. So that makes it endergonic, and that makes the free energy more than zero. And so this whole piece also connects back to dehydration synthesis, and energy is required for that process to work. So if we're looking at another good way to look at the whole entire piece, this slide gives you almost everything you need from this entire lecture. So again, if we're going from big piece to small piece, in this case, we're going from ATP to ADP. It is a catabolic reaction because we're first of all going from big to small pieces. It's exergonic because we're releasing energy out. It's hydrolysis because in order to go from that big piece to the smaller pieces, we're adding water to the process, and it's exergonic as well. And again, back through the flip side, going from ADP building back up to ATP, which means we're adding another phosphate onto that. We are doing an anabolic reaction, which means we're going from small pieces building back up. It's endergonic, which means that we are retaining energy to make it work. We're pulling energy in. The energy is the Gibbs free energy is higher than zero, and it is dehydration synthesis. So this is probably the best piece or the best slide that will go through all of the pieces. All right. So as far as this lecture, it's actually pretty simple. As far as how much information is there, it's basically pushing or building upon some of the things that we've already done and adding a few vocabulary words that is um, building up our repertoire as far as catabolic, anabolic, and how that all fits into energy and how it works. And so this particular lecture is super short. So next week, when we do chemiosmosis and when we add photosynth or cellular respiration into it, this will make a lot more sense in how those processes actually connect back to those chemiosmosis and cellular respiration. So that is it for the lecture. If you guys have questions, again, probably a good one to miss as far as if we're going to do something outside of class without having a lot of information. This one actually is one of the more simple lectures. And I hope it makes sense. If not, we will go through questions with you during lecture on Tuesday. I hope you have a wonderful holiday, and I will see you then.